Yes, sir. अभी आपके लिए कोई प्रोग्राम नहीं था माइंड आप फाइल उठना करते हैं ठीक है
We talk about the aim, we talk about the project technologies. A few days back, a sustainable reconstruction method. Hi everyone, welcome to our exhibition. We're currently at Sept Research launch, NIMPA launch, and we're going to talk about limited exhibition of the project 3D for Heritage India, a sustainable reconstruction method for seismic-prone heritage areas of India based on advanced recording technologies. A few days back, we held this exhibition at Bela for the community, and we're holding it again here for the students of Sept University, Masters in Computational Regeneration, and a few external visitors. I'm just going to give you a little brief layout of the exhibition. So here we have introduction panels. We talk about the aim, we talk about the project timeline and the organizations involved, a little bit about their bio. We then go into why Bela, a little bit about the maps, and we go into the data, which you'll see later on in the seminar. Further, we go into more drawings of, we have a drone map located over here. We did two technologies, 3D laser scanning and drone photography. And finally, we have our puzzle counter here with a very interested individual currently pursuing that. So yeah, it's very easy to do the puzzles without, with looking at it, but without gets a little tough. So yeah, we move further on. We then have the same map displayed as 42 panels over here with a little bit of details that I just put out. And this is a QR code of our website which we'll share with you. Please do go and check it out. It's called 3D for Heritage India, and we look forward to seeing you at the exhibition at 4. Thank you.
And where should I place the screen? Here. Where should I place the screen? Should I place here so that you can see? हाँ yes I did.
यू डिड ना ओके तो वो यूट्यूब पे भी दिखेगा
YouTube पे दिखेगा.
यूट्यूब
Zoom
से
की chat में ही जाएगा.
जूम तो यूट्यूब पे भी डाल सकते हैं हाँ ठीक है हाँ शी
पाचल पाचल पाचल.
वी डोंट नीड दिस थिंग राइट इट इज लाइव नाउ वी आर लाइव नो वी कैन स्टॉप दैट एनी
चालू करवा.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone, and my sincere apologies on behalf of everyone for this technical glitch that we are facing. Yeah. Are we?
आपके पिताजी के साइड
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone, and I welcome you all on behalf of Center for Heritage Conservation and all our project partners, Nottingham Trent University, ICROM, and Hunnarshala Foundation. My sincere apologies for this technical glitch and the delay because of this. We are still trying to sort out certain issues. We should be soon there, but meanwhile, I would like to start with the introduction of the project and introduction of our today's speakers. So the today's seminar is organized as a part of our project called 3D for Heritage India, a sustainable reconstruction method for seismic-prone heritage areas of India based on advanced recording technologies. So we have been working on this project for since November 2020, and as a part of this project, we have been working in Kutch along with all our project partners. And today, through the exhibition and through this seminar, we are presenting the work done so far, the data captured and the processing and the community engagement. The same exhibition, this morning we had the exhibition, it has been also shared with the community in village called Bela. That's why the today's seminar is also titled as Digital Bela, Architectural Heritage in a New Light. So that's the project background, and I would like to introduce all the speakers today. I would like to welcome Professor Gamal, Dr. Bernadette, Dr. Jigna, our today's moderator, Dr. Gauri Bharat, and Dr. Rohit Jigyasu. Professor Gamal and Dr. Bernadette, they are from Nottingham Trent University. Bernadette is our principal investigator. Professor Gamal, Dr. Jigna, they are mainly the experts for the community engagement and how to take these practices further for society's benefit. And Dr. Rohit is from ICROM. He's the expert on disaster risk management. So that's how our entire team is. And we have partnered with Hunnarshala Foundation. On their behalf, we also have Aditya and Tanvi with us. So they have been the instrumental people in all the work that we have been doing in Bela. So I would like to hand it over to today's first speaker, Bernadette, without further much delay. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Just 1 second while I take the presentation. Thank you. So thank you very much for being here presently at the people we have here, and all the ones that are connected in different parts of the world. I hope. Yes.
म्यूट रखिए आप म्यूट ना छू
I muted. Is that okay? It's a little bit of echo. Should I carry on?
In your Zoom, you need to.
And my Zoom is already off.
Are you mute on Zoom?
ऑडियो के लैपटॉप से स्लो ऑफ
It's off. It's off.
स्पीकर स्पीकर
Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Sorry. That was really odd. Let me set the presentation. Can you see my screen? No, I have to share it, right? Yes. Sorry for this. There you go. Can you see my screen now? Yes? Good. Okay. So I'll try to be quick because we are a little bit late. Today I will be presenting the potential of 3D laser scanning for the reconstruction of seismic areas. And it's a little bit through the project we're doing, a little bit of previous experience from Chile. Post-earthquake reconstruction in heritage settlements of housing in heritage settlements confronts challenges such as inadequate damage assessment and replacement, displaced population, and loss of heritage significance. Recording the built fabric and ways of life within heritage settlements are key for conserving their historic value, which is increasingly possible with the evolution of digital technologies. The ongoing research project that we're presenting today is developing a novel methodology for heritage conservation and post-disaster reconstruction using state-of-the-art 3D laser scanning technologies, also known as LiDAR technologies, and photos and air drones as well, to enable comprehensive damage assessment and design of solutions for repair, retrofitting, reuse, and disaster risk mitigation of housing, while virtually conserving the living heritage of vernacular settlements in Kutch, Gujarat. I am lucky to lead the most amazing research team from 4 institutions, each one providing different inputs to the project, expertise and experience to develop this project. And last week, you can all see them there in the screen, and last week we obtained additional funding through which we are adding a new team member from December, the Gujarat Institute of Disaster Risk Management, which is with the aim of integrating the research results at an institutional scale for exploiting its future implementation and the future scaling up of this methodology in other areas of India. The focus of this research is on housing in heritage areas, non-monumental heritage, meaning the vernacular architecture of houses built mainly by inhabitants as an economical and affordable response to local climatic and environmental conditions. After earthquakes, damaged dwellings cannot be immediately retrofitted because there is a focus on shelter provision. Houses in heritage areas are usually left in a standby mode, waiting for specific answers for a long time, and this affects the livelihoods for long periods of time, resulting in people living in unsafe structures. One of the main challenges in this context is the documentation of dwellings in order to repair and reconstruct. The use of new technologies to record the built environment is increasing as they become affordable and more accessible than ever before. Among them, 3D laser scanning can provide accurate documentation of the reality in the form of a measurable colored 3D point cloud in a short period of time, from which different outcomes can be created. This video, for example, shows 2 houses scanned in 2 days in the context of another project done and funded by NTU with CHC, the Center for Heritage Conservation at CEPT Development and Research Foundation as a project partner, aiming to transfer knowledge and create local capacities for surveying with 3D laser scanning with the students. Once the digital model of the reality is obtained, it offers a basis for damage assessments, improving the chances of a rapid and effective response, as well as offering a technical platform for risk mitigation measures. The visual outcomes of the record also enabling working with the community, increasing resilience. The innovation is not in the technology itself, but in how we use it as a part of a research method to tackle at the same time the wider scale of the village and the smaller scale of the housing. The The longer-term aim is to break the unsustainable cycle of building replacement and rebuilding after earthquake. So the idea is to move to a culture of constant maintenance and risk mitigation and reuse that can conserve not only the houses but the community that live in them, and reduce this idea of demolishing and building anew every time. This project is informed by previous research on post-earthquake reconstruction of heritage villages in Chile. That was part of my PhD, finished in 2018. Working from my previous experience in Chile is relevant as a learning experience, but also as a learning experience from one case to the other, but also as a potential scalable methodology to other seismic areas. Chile and India are both located in completely high seismic areas. So both countries, the whole area is located in seismic areas. With India's large population, improving seismic response will also lead to less fatalities and hopefully to more adaptability to earthquakes. By bringing past insights from Chile, we aim to exploit these new uses of technology to enhance the number and quality of buildings conserved. I propose the idea of reconstruction as an alternative vision to current reconstruction approaches, mainly based on uncritical replication. The main issue in Chile was to develop a strategy to repair and work from what is left after an earthquake, rather than leaving original houses in ruins and using only its shape as a basis for the design for the new houses only. So there is an issue of authenticity here that I further explore. And the idea how we can use systematic recording as a way of disaster risk mitigation as well. I question the current way that reconstruction processes are being seen and are being implemented. And one of the ideas here is to use the record to enhance the values that are underneath or that are at the core of vernacular constructions: sustainability, economic affordability of materials, using local materials, and so on. As a methodology, in 2013, I recorded 3 heritage areas in Chile that were affected by different earthquakes. And this was an experiment to see how much data could be captured in a short period of 3 days, resembling a post-earthquake emergency situation, with extra days for collecting social information. I did this with the help of Diego Ramirez, who also gave me access to the scanner. And how you can get, in little time, you can get a lot of data, and there's a safer way to capture data, especially in buildings that are half ruined and that are potentially dangerous. I proposed design strategies to increase reparation and reuse of buildings, and argued for the introduction of the technology institutionally. This is Zúñiga, and in Zúñiga there was a lot of, also captured the whole area in 3 days with a high layer of detail, but you can see also the more accuracy that you can get with a 3-laser scanner compared with hand measurements. And the third village was Lolol, which had an ongoing process of reconstruction, and captured some houses in ruins that are decayed now. And all of this is summarized in this publication that was part of this project as the learning inputs that we could bring for the research projects here in India. And one of the most important points was this, that there was a strategy in Chile to repair houses after the earthquakes, using steel meshes, using wooden timber frames, and so on, but this was not massively implemented. And the reason why it was not massively implemented was because it was very difficult to obtain how the houses were and how the houses were being utilized, and what was the status of the houses. And this is why it's important to use the new technologies to kind of capture that and work from that. So we have adjusted this for the project in India, And this is more the activities we have been doing so far. The first was a reconnaissance trip. Jigna will explain that in detail. But in this reconnaissance trip, there were some villages, shortlisted. There was here the CHC and the Hunashala Foundation got a lot of information of how many houses there were and the status of the constructions and so on. And based on all this information, we combined that all information and decided to focus on Bela. And one of the reasons was that Bela was damaged by the 2001 earthquake that occurred here in India, but it was not completely collapsed. The second activity was the data capture field trip that was done by the CHC. And one of the challenges of this project was that it was being done during COVID. So we were not able to travel and capture the data by ourselves, but we used this project, the Surveying Heritage Buildings in Ahmedabad, India, empowering local action and skills for heritage conservation, as a way to train the people here, train the staff and students here, so then the data capture in Bela could be done basically by the local team here in India. So during a week on site, our project partners here, they did this amazing work of capturing the data, and they also used a drone to get aerial data. Regarding research dissemination, we have summarized what the project has been doing so far. So we have this paper, which is open access. And there's also a document that will be released at the end of the project, which is a guidance document on how to use 3 laser scanning technology for post-earthquake contexts. And also, we will have a final journal article. And also, the idea is to do a short policy brief with some key aspects on how this could be implemented at a more institutional level. And after the data capture field trip, there was the need to post-process the data. So we post-processed the data in the UK. There were 335 scans that were processed by our research fellow, Felipe Lanuza. And this is basically like as I was explaining in the morning, like creating like a jigsaw puzzle, because each one of the scans is located in one position, and it needs to be located with other scans in order to create the whole model of it. So you can see here in each scan in each color, and then basically it's about creating a cluster. And then after the cluster, you can relate the whole village, as you see here. This is a top view of the digital version of Bela, and a video that is kind of looking after this data. And here, we face a lot of challenges, mainly the heat. But one of the things that is interesting to mention is this idea of putting everything together. So we scanned, Mududula and CIUS scanned 18 buildings interiorly, and the connection in between those buildings. So we have this larger scale of the village and the smaller scale of the housing, with the same level of detail. And that's obviously offering the opportunity to understand the houses in their own contexts, which is very relevant in this case in Bela, because the location of these houses also belongs to different castes, which is something that probably Jigna will touch upon later on. And with this information, Felipe created this sort of master map. And this is really relevant in the context of post-disasters action. Because when you arrive to these places and you don't have normally any information, a map like this with some information of the houses that we can combine, with AutoCAD drawings, and you can combine with aerial information from Google Earth, for example, then you can start using these maps to start, placing social information captured as well, who is inhabiting the houses, what is the status of the houses, understanding how much damage they had. And this master map is very relevant for that, and also for understanding potential risk prevention measures, mitigation measures is the word. So I'm aware of the time. Just wanted to show you this kind of level of detail of some of the houses. And as I said before, we're analyzing this information and crossing it with the social information obtained from the questionnaires and interviews that the Hunnarsala and the CHC did during the field trip. So here, for example, you have one of the houses, and for each one of the 18 buildings, I've created plans, sections, elevations, the aerial drone view as well, and as a set of everything that was compiled in a booklet that is part of this exhibition, and booklet that was given to the owners and caretakers of the houses. And this is an effort not only it's an effort that informs potential design strategies, but also it's a visualization effort for people to understand their houses and for us to understand how the houses are, how they're being used, and the status of them. So this is one house which is in a good state overall, and I will show you this other one, which is a temple. This one, where you can see here the distortion of the wall produced by the earthquake. So these visualizations allow us to understand and allow us to analyze, the angles of distortions, the cracks produced by the earthquakes. And this is a very good example, because in the previous field trip, we can see here how the person is repairing this wall. And now that we have just went there for the latest field trip, that wall fell. That wall completely fell with the monsoon rains. So basically, and we scanned it again. And this is very important, because then we have the data to compare both things. And with these visualizations, we can also look and assess the risk assessment. So we can go to the person there, also explain to them that there is no wall filling that will make any difference unless they tackle the problem, the structural issues that this house has. Sorry, I went very quickly. So basically, this was the latest activity. I'm not going to say much about this because Gina will. But the idea is basically to use the record to engage with the community and to show, for example, here, this is what I was trying to explain. So in this booklet, with these images, you can explain the structural problems to the community, so they can use they can understand what are the problems there and create repairs that could be useful, and also make them aware of the risks, because probably where to escaping routes and things like that. And there is a website where we're putting all this information together, and it was very good that it was translated as well. So people actually, it helped to engage with the younger generation that were looking at this website while we were there. There are these 4 activities coming from the next 4 months. And just as a way to conclude, I want to touch into 2 aspects. Sorry, this thing is running by itself. So first is that, as in any other way of representation, drawing from 3D scan data is the representation of a particular moment in time. Things change, especially in context of earthquakes. And as we have seen in a couple of months, a complete house already changed. So this opens up a lot of discussion on the role of this data in the conservation and the physical conservation of heritage buildings, which is something to be covered in the monograph. And also, I want to highlight a couple of things from the project, which is first, sorry, I don't know what this is running by itself, but first, that the associated training scheme was successful, and it was a very good way to make these technologies more accessible. and also allow us to work remotely, which was very important in the context of COVID. Also, that the reconstruction method that we're proposing here goes beyond the documentation. The idea is not just document, but using the data in a complete new way and for other purposes. And it has to be combined with other types of information, social, archival, historic information. And also to understand as well that the LiDAR record is being used as a basis to understand things that are needed, like visualize, like understanding vernacular architecture, how it works, how earthquake resistant are vernacular traditional techniques. And finally, to highlight the importance of the process of the research. Because it is not only the research itself, but the different institutions that are involved, and I think Jigna will touch much more on that. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry to be so rushed.
Thank you, Bernadette, and may I request Professor Gamal to actually share his screen and start.
Yes, this one.
Yeah. Thank you, Bernadette, and may I request Professor Gamal to start with his lecture, because we are already really running behind. Thank you.
Just a second, give me a second, Mordula, thank you for the introduction. Just give me a second, I'm adjusting my slides. Do you see my screen? Do you see my screen? And do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see your screen. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot. Right.
Thank you, Dr. Rohit. I think we are facing some problems with the audio here. Thank you for stepping in.
No worries, thank you. So thanks a lot, Mordula, and thanks, Jigna. Really appreciate the hosting of this seminar, and we, as Bernadette, the project lead for this fantastic collaboration, have summarized our appreciation to the collaboration between Nottingham Trent University, Chrome, and SAPT University and Hornshala Foundation. My role today is actually to give an overview about how we look at Nottingham Trent University at digital technology as facilitator and supportive for community heritage and sustainable development. And in my talk, I just will give a general overview about our vision and principle, and then try to give a kind of a very brief accounts and narratives about our research activities elsewhere. Because as wonderful and exceptional this project is, I know that it already has been covered by Bernadette and will continue to be covered by Jigna later in the program. And just as a kind of overview about the Center of Architecture for Architecture, Urbanism, and Global Heritage, we are set out at Nottingham Trent University, and we have a specific agenda, and this research agenda looking at how to preserve and democratize cultural heritage, and basically try to really take a unique perspective about heritage as belonging to the community and to the people, rather than a very internationally institutionalized through international organization. So we always have been looking at heritage as something that produced, consumed, and preserved by communities in different parts of the world. And hence, accordingly, we look at how to engage with communities. And I think the project in Bela and our work with SAPT University and with the Center for Heritage Conservation is a perfect demonstration of how this agenda really can come to fruition and can engage communities on multiple levels. But at the same time, as Bernadette mentioned, the virtual technologies have a lot of potential and a lot of role to play. And accordingly, there are multiple use and multiple applications in different contexts, depends on the context and challenges. And key to this, and I think, again, this project and lots of other projects that we work on, have been successful during the pandemic because we have been working in partnerships. We do not expect only to travel ourselves with our equipment, but actually sometimes similar to this project, we have worked closely with the Center for Earth Conservation, and they have actually managed all the work and all the field work and data collection gathering on the ground while we were working from our offices in Nottingham. So there's a lot of great opportunities here for equitable collaboration and partnerships. And we have a lot of projects that have been really demonstrated, sorry, used to demonstrate such kind of collaboration. But the key element for my talk today is about the connection between digital technologies and and cultural heritage. Here, in that sense, people have always looked at technology as something of an elitist nature that really has less to do with communities, especially in far and remote areas. But we look at it as the use of smart heritage technology is just a great asset for environments and heritage, for preserving environment and heritage sites. But at the same time, it really can help us look at more sustainable and future-proof models for engagement and visitor experience. Because as great as the heritage is, it just still exists in contexts that sometimes very hard to reach. And at the same time, that we know that heritage as part of our built environment that keep changing and keep some of them part of it is disappearing. So how, as perhaps as like the case in post earthquake or post disasters. So in that sense, how the technology can help with that, and actually this helps us to sometimes to find new lease of life to heritage sites, but also we can really create a new vision for the future of museums and across the globe. Our project span a wide range of contexts, as you can see from this map, perhaps that shows how far we are engaging with different places across the globe. But if without technologies, we won't be able to really work in partnerships with partners like SAT in India, but also work in China, in Egypt, in Jordan, Iraq, and in the UK. This is how we really technology facilitate such kind of collaboration partnerships. And in that sense, that digital technologies can really bridge boundaries between bridge space and time, and they help us to work together to preserve fantastic heritage sites in different parts of the world. But at the same time, we learn through those experiences how heritage is very peculiar to different communities. So the way that heritage communities are connected and to cultural heritage and built heritage in Bela in India and Gujarat is different from the ones in Jordan, in Iraq, and Egypt. So the peculiarities and understanding of heritage on the local ground, on the local context, is very crucial in that sense. And then just going back a little bit theoretically about the future, about our common heritage, because at the end, just our heritage as a global endeavor of humanities is just worth preserving, every part of it. So effectively, the archaeology of a built environment and the world heritage as a common agenda is stemmed from the fact that we have shared values, shared principles. And while the UNESCO and ICROM, for example, as a big advocate that just have really managed to help us preserve wonderful heritage sites from natural disasters or from even man-made disasters, similar to Nubia project in 1960s. But actually, they helped us to really see how the power and the hegemony of political agendas sometimes change. And we can see this over the years. So relying on top-down agendas from the international organization won't be a feasible way into preserving as much as we could. And this takes me to the next point about how the heritage can be really looked at from the community perspective. While we look from a heritage site as a kind of a nice, fantastic place to really visit on one go, but actually people who are living on it or in it around 365 days a year are actually the more connected to it, the main key stakeholders, and the ones that really are interested in, because effectively memory is actually the fabric community way of is the fabric of the community way of life. And we have studied a lot about how architecture and memory are connected to the way that we learn our cultural education. We sometimes overlook the way that how existing history buildings in our community really connect to the stories and the memories of the people. How families really transcended generations, how people moved from one place to another. There's a lot of knowledge, a lot of information, not a lot of education value in preserving heritage and built heritage. But at the same time, through our research and example from engagement work, we understand that cultural heritage is fluid, just continue to change. There will be consistent loss of heritage with natural disasters like what Bernadette and Regina will have talked about, and we'll talk about it later today. But also, there are many competing demands on political agendas and the ideologies from governance, from what is to preserve and what not to preserve, how we really manage resources, what kind of constitute to be a victory, similar to battles like what we happen in against ISIS and preserving cultural heritage in Iraq and Syria against radical organizations. But at the same time, how we can really preserve that. So actually preserving cultural heritage before the post event happens is very important. And I think here where digital technology can help us and have already helped us to preserve some of the heritage sites before they are being destroyed or have been lost to natural disasters. But the key element here, how it helps vulnerable communities, because communities need also livelihood, economic values, and how we can really help them first to preserve their buildings and history, but at the same time to connect to technology in one way or another. So if you have lost perhaps the physical heritage, still you have a digital version of it. So you can connect stories, you can connect the narrative, you can connect at least some of the cultural knowledge, languages, and heritage difference. And hence, this framework or this kind of vision help us to place communities at the center. We strongly believe that to preserve heritage sites and practice, and we need to really invest in the communities. We need to look at how they managed to develop that heritage in the first place, how they handed it down over the generations, and to look at the process rather than the product. So not only the building itself, but the process through which the building was created, how a group of buildings were connected together, and how heritage or tourism and economy, even social justice, have really managed to really make that heritage is viable for the community. And hence, sustainable development goals is actually looking at people and try to preserve and support people to preserve their own heritage rather than come through a selective number of monuments or World Heritage sites to re-preserve and then leave the rest of the country just behind. So we are trying to really challenge this kind of the top-down agenda and looking at the community as the central aspects and stakeholders to heritage and how to preserve that. But how to do that? Here we are trying to look at how technology can really support such agenda. So a few quick questions here. In what way should we use virtual heritage technologies and how it could benefit communities? So we try to develop that laser heritage technologies, and actually it's a part of many things where you can really record some of the heritage sites. And here we are talking about Nottingham Castle in Nottingham, which has been changing over the past few years. So many people really have lost that part of the heritage because they developed into new settings now. So they have no access on the previous version of that castle. But also there are some parts of that history has changed. But if this is the case, so how can the virtual heritage technologies work as effective agent for heritage protections? Here we looked at some of the most challenging contexts in the case of conflict. So in post-Iraq war and American invasion, but also in the ISIS aftermath of ISIS bombings of many historic sites in Iraq, we have worked with the Iraqi governments to go to the most historic street in the middle of Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, and we have looked at how the heritage, how the ignorance and the wars and conflict have left a lot of historic sites of one of the most historic streets in the country have actually been left behind. There is a continuous damage, the continuous erosion, but also the change of land use, and there is no much viability from that kind of point of view. So when there, with our laser scanning, we have documented all the remnants of that historic, valuable, historic, and intricate architecture ornaments and features. But at the same time, we studied the historic, the economic activities, trades, how people, connections between people and product and process operated. And we developed a strategy for preserving the whole site for that particular street, which is now with the government to develop. But one of the most devastating 21st century disasters is just what happened to the city, the old, most very historic, uniquely diverse city in northern Iraq, which used to have over million people, but actually have also a lot of cultural differences, Christians, Jews, and Muslims of different faith. And yet, with ISIS, with their ideological agenda, they have destroyed much of that city deliberately. Part of it is just to try to show and erase some of that fantastic history of diversity, but also have impacted the way that the city itself has operated. So 90% of the people of Old Mosul have departed. Much of their cultural heritage from the library, from the traditions, the cultural practices, even the books have really disappeared. And effectively, we are trying now to race against time to preserve that trades, the culture, the practice. And we have looked at the markets. We have done a study of studying old markets of Mosul. So while the UNESCO and people like the team, the fantastic team of ICROM, are training people on craft development, on understanding how to preserve that buildings, we are looking at the processes and how the city operated in before the war and how the crafts started to disappear, but what are the traces of those crafts and gathering in everyday life. Similarly, in Nottingham, a 1,000-year street of a lace market that has disappeared, that its history has changed a lot. So through a digital documentation of all the buildings on that street, we have managed to preserve much of its history, dig into the archives, getting the stories about where the lace craft has developed, how we can look at unique architecture elements, and we knitted it together in an exhibition that we have done a few months ago in Nottingham Castle, which really brings that focus on the architecture peculiarities of the buildings along with the stories. Here, I'm sorry, I will run this a bit quickly because I know I have limited time. Then brings us to the next, to the question two: how digital technologies made access to cultural heritage more exclusive or inclusive accessible. Here is the thing about heritage, that some of the heritage sites lose their assets over time. So in one of the most brilliant historic sites in Egypt that is not many people know hear a lot about it, Hawara Pyramid and Labyrinth. It has a fantastic history, which is this extends to 4,000 years old. Yet much of its collection now nowhere to be seen on site, and the site is barely a remnant of an old pyramid. But actually, the collections that have been gathered by archaeologists in the late 19th and early 20th century was effectively the main product in the old art galleries in London and New York in the and in 1910s and 1920s. Its collections now coming from that site are now spread around 46 museum collections around the globe, from Japan to New York to Los Angeles and to at least in Manchester, Liverpool, and London. So effectively, the history of that site is spread across the globe, but none of those assets actually connected to the site on the ground. So what we did, we really traced many of those heritage collections, artifacts, and along with the scanning and digitally scanning those kind of sites on the ground, and try to really see how we can really develop that history, bring it back together, how we can really interrogate that buildings, and how we, as you can see here, putting back that rich narratives into a very barely site, as you can see it on the right hand side. But if you look at the left hand side, that you will see that this is a kind of a very rich heritage have been done in place. So if you look at some stage of it, this is a complex in building to enable people to really look at it in a more inclusive and natural way to appreciate its history. So that site is actually now neglected, but actually if you look at how the history of that site have evolved over the years, actually you will know that there's a lot to it. Sorry. So here, for example, one very quick view of how the site has
from 1000 BCE.
so how the site existed, at least as per the Greek-Roman records. Then we have created a long video about really how the digital model of that site will help you to really see how the site and appreciate how the site really existed and how was a kind of demonstration of the greatness of that area. So this is a remote area. No, very rarely people will visit it, but actually digital technologies help us to really move on and really see beyond what's already on the ground. Final thing here about museums of future, a project that really we have looked at it and how novel opportunity digital technology can provide novel opportunities and new lease supplies for activities in museums. Working with 40 museums, we just developed a report on survey of 40 museums in the UK about the Swiss Museum, looking at space collections and history, and we applied that through a virtual model of Nottingham Castle, looking at how the castle itself and its gallery has developed over time, but also provide a very unique details of architecture documentation, along with internal tours and virtual tours of the castle. We created a virtual tour for the castle while it was closed, and part of it is just this walk down through the galleries. So just I will skip all that part and then, yeah, so just a kind of an overview about these things. Our work in the UK has been looked at in a very favorable vision about how this will help us achieve the sustainable development goals. And this is a very contentious point that we have worked with UNESCO UK on it, just how digital technologies could be a valuable asset in heritage preservation policy and practice. So we have worked with them to develop a series of principles and recommendations of how digital technology and interdisciplinary research bring that missing history, missing stories, and bring it back to life through digital versions, but also use innovation and creativity to create new economic opportunities, new industries, and new stories. Our work has been cited as case study in the latest UNESCO UK report, and then highlight the challenges like digital inequalities and equal access to heritage. Thank you very much. But one thing to take away from my presentation here about digital technologies, that you must know that is people who have number of people around the globe who have access to mobile phones are more than the people that have access to toilets, sanitary, basic sanitary services. So we cannot really overlook the fact that the digital technologies are being more accessible, more facilitating to so many people that sometimes that's more even our basic needs. Thank you very much, and I hope this will set the context for the importance of digital technologies and in-heritage communication very well. I'm happy to have any questions later in the session if you like. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Gamal. I've taken the mic over from Ridula. So we'll move on to Rohit's presentation so that we can save more time at the end. Gamal will be taking questions at the end. If anybody from who's joined online has any questions, please feel free to put it into the chat window. You can also put it into YouTube, where this is being live streamed. Rohit, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay. I suppose you can.
The screen is just coming on.
Okay.
Not yet. We are not able to see it yet.
Well, let's. I don't know. It seems to be my computer seems to be getting hanged. So I mean, let me just see what happens. I think my computer is not responding right now. So let me just. I'll have to switch back again. Sorry about that. Just a moment.
So Rohit, if you need a few minutes to sort this out, should we start with Jigna's presentation and then you come back after that?
Yes, I think that would be better. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so then Jigna, over to you.
Rohit, you'll have to stop sharing your screen so that I can share mine. Yeah, thank you. I'll share my screen. Okay, so I think what I'm going to present here is more of an extension of what Bernadette had talked about in terms of what was the purpose of why are we doing this research, and what are the outcomes of it. And she presented the purpose and the outcome quite well. I'm going to kind of talk about the in between and the field work that we did. And I think it's my extreme privilege to be representing many people here. I'm not just speaking for myself, I'm speaking for Mridula, ZS, Aditya, Tanvi, I think everybody who worked on field. It's all of their inputs, their thoughts that and discussions that we had that has eventually come over here. I'll also kind of take a little bit from what extend the question of community and heritage that Kamal had presented, and he's talking about why it is important for heritage to be discussed from the point of view of communities, and that not all heritage is going to be conserved through top-down approach. And if we're really interested in conserving heritage, it has to be looked at from the community perspective, and it has to be looked at from the bottom-up perspective. And most of what I'm going to talk about over here is kind of exactly lying in that intersection of how community relates to heritage, how community interacts with one another, and how the community in this, and that a community is not a homogeneous whole, and it kind of different parts of the community interact with the same set of buildings that we otherwise can as the same set of buildings in very different ways. And our processes, while we started off as standard processes that we otherwise kind of consider when we are kind of working with the communities and discussing with the communities, one thing that this project and many projects before have taught us is that you need a lot of agility. And once you meet the community and once you have certain discussions initially, you have to constantly be on the go of constantly adapting your processes so that you are able to not only capture the diversity of relationships there, but you're able to engage with the diversity within the community, and you're able to be ethical about it. You're able to stand your ethical grounds. That's what I'm going to talk about today. So I think all of you know the area of Kutch. This is what we were looking at, and what Bernadette was talking about was our first set of villages that we looked at. Aditya from Hunarshala had identified, our first thing was that we were looking at, there were certain criteria which we were looking at villages. You've already seen this screen, but we were looking at certain criteria. So criteria basically were that we should be able to have in those villages certain building stock, if we have to call it, that is representative of the devastation that happened at the time of 2001 earthquake, because we are looking at specifically a post-disaster situation. We were looking at that building stock. So that was our first criteria of identifying villages. The second is that whoever is living in that village, they should be willing to engage with us. They should be willing to host us. They should be willing to talk to us. That was the second criteria. The third criteria was accessibility to many of these structures. So while there are many villages where we found that there is very little intervention, and you can see the post-2001 earthquake scenario. The villages were just abandoned just like that, and maybe relocated, or people migrated to different places. But they were so in such bad condition that we would not be able to enter, or the people who live there have just locked the places and we don't know how to enter places. So accessibility was another issue. And of course, whenever we are accessing the house, anyone's house, this is a lesson that we also tell you, that you're not supposed to break anything and enter. You're supposed to be asking before getting into a house. So that was another criteria. And presence of other heritage assets, that apart from the building stock that we are looking at, there should be certain relationships from the point of view of communities, cultural memory, or communities, cultural associations. Closer? Yeah. Communities, cultural association that they already have. So there's a sense of belonging that's there to that community. So yeah, we looked at, as Aditya was explaining in the morning, we looked at, he identified 15 villages where we could potentially that we could potentially study. Then he shortlisted 11 villages. Then Mridula, Aditya and I went to these 11 villages, and then we further identified 2 villages. And I think those 2 villages were purely from the point of view of willingness of stakeholders. These were the 2 villages where the stakeholders said, yeah, come here, we'll make sure you have everything, and we'll make sure you have a place to stay. We'll make sure we'll get you permissions, we'll make sure we'll get you connected to the other community. So there was a lot of willingness, and there was also a willingness to extend this idea further, that the recognition that what is there is of value, what is in the village is of heritage value, and that something needs to be done about it. That recognition was also very important for us to even kind of engage with it. Otherwise, it's just scanning without the discussion of value in it. So the Bela and Roha were 2 villages where we found we found that we were able to engage better. Like in all, like in all projects, Bernadette and Felipe, they worked on a kind of a questionnaire for us to fill up in order to take these decisions. And this was the first time when we realized that in Kutch, in many urban areas, questionnaires work. So when in Ahmedabad, when we do surveys, or even sometimes students who were working in Dharmaj to a certain extent, because it's a kind of a town where properties have ownerships, and there are certain legalities that are very clear, and there is a specific authority of that. There's a Nagarpalika or there is a municipality. Certain things can be answered through questionnaires. But this was the first time when we found that when we started asking questions about how many number of buildings, or what are who are the different communities that are living here, who used to live here, how many are open, how many are closed, we realized that we could not, the questionnaire was not the kind of right way of going about it, even from the point of view of what happened after earthquake, how many houses got reconstructed. There were a lot of ambiguous answers that we were getting, and the reasons are many. The reasons are, I think many of you will in future, not this batch, but I think your earlier batch has done the questionnaires, and they would realize that it's not, when you ask definitive questions, it's not going to be easy to get those answers. So even in this Reconnaissance survey, we relied a lot on our own observations. So we clicked a lot of photographs, and then we kind of identified how many of these are closed, how many of these are open. And then we looked at, for example, if certain houses were reconstructed, whether they were supported by the government, whether it was reconstructed by the owners themselves, or whether it was supported by an NGO. We looked at indicators of materiality. We looked at indicators of commonality and things like that to be able to understand. So for example, in a village called Vrajvani, we realized that there was a little board of a particular religious organization on all houses, and they were all very similar. So it was a good indicator for us to say that, well, all of these were reconstructed with money from this particular religious organization. There were some places where you would find a certain kind of standardization, where the same housing unit is repeated, and you realize that this is a classic indicator of a government rehabilitation. So we used a lot of those indicators rather than questionnaires. Of course, there was previous material, a lot of it that Hunarshala had in their own records, because Hunarshala worked a lot on post-earthquake reconstruction and community engagement. So there was a lot of data that they had. Rohit also worked on a post-earthquake reconstruction in Kutch, and he had certain studies and data, and I had some research that I had done in 2012. So combining all of that, we were able to fill up the first set of questionnaire, and that was our first telltale sign that we are not going to be able to go with the standard survey methods, and we'll have to kind of be a little innovative, but at the same time not unethical about what we put out, and we have to find a way of doing this. Bernadette has already spoken about it, so I'm not going to get into the detail. This is just the map of fault lines in Bhuj and where the different, in Kutch, and where the different villages are located. And this is Bela in Rapar. And there's certain data about Bela. You'll see that It's kind of quite close to the Pakistan border, and we actually found out a lot of history about this place when we were having those community communications. And we had other historical assets over here. There was a Darbargarh. There were many memorial stones, some of which are also protected by the state archaeology, is what we found out. And there were some previous records. And we had the village Sarpanch, Lakshman Singh Waghela, whose son was also here. And then actually when we contacted him, we realized that long back, I think 3 years back, I had got an email from an individual saying that you are not looking at Bela, you are a heritage organization and you are not looking at Bela, and that's a problem. And when I started talking to, when we met Lakshman Singh, and he said, my son has been after some organization. And I realized, well, I think somebody did email me, and we realized that was his son. So it kind of created a very interesting circle that gave us a lot of access to kind of say that, well, we had approached you, we want to do this, we want to bring this out, we want people to know that Bela is very valuable. I think that was the reason eventually that we felt that Bela would be the right place, not that Roha was not a good place to engage, and not that we did not get support in Roha, but it was almost like, there's a history to wanting to engage with this place, and that sort of pushed us to go to Bela. Yeah, these are some images. You've seen, many of you who were here in the exhibition, you've seen these images. These are all on our website, what Bela looks like, the streetscape. You'll also see that much of Bela is empty. Many of the communities from the central area of Bela have moved out, like Lakshman Singh's son, who was here today afternoon and was very happy with what we've done. So that was a very heartening interaction to have. Some of the houses, as you can see, are reconstructed, and this was one of the house that was reconstructed by Lakshman Singh himself. This was another house which had very little damage and very little repair were done. We also could find houses that were highly damaged and not repaired, and diverse, very different kind of technologies that we also saw here. The Darbargarh was a kind of a revelation in itself, and we thought that as an heritage asset becomes quite important. Mrudula, the first thing she did was made a map of what was located where, and when we started making the map, we realized that Bela is much bigger than this, and that's when we started realizing that there are other communities with whom we've not interacted, we are not interacting, and that kind of became a marker of kind of a mental note that we need to extend our search from what we are doing. So when we went there, I think it was sometime in August, I'm forgetting now. When we went there, so it was a team, there was Sukrit from ICROM, Aditya Tanvi from Hunarshala, and Mrudula, CS, Rishi and Astha. Astha is one of our students, so they were all there. And what we thought was that with the time we had, and after we realized that Bela is much bigger than what we were imagining it to be, and we are going to take a lot more time to actually document and scan than what we had thought, that it's going to be a 3-day affair. We realized it's going to be a 6-day affair. So the first thing we decided is that let's kind of divide, and one group will look at community interaction, the other group will look at the digital documentation, and of course there's going to be a lot of overlap, and this was a kind of sequence that we identified. The first was to interact with the house owners to get their consent, to get them to agree that we are going to scan their houses and that they're okay with it. It's all right to scan public places and streets, but the moment you go inside people's houses, it's important to interact with them, explain what you're doing, because people saying yes without understanding what they are getting into is highly problematic. So first thing was to have those interactions. Then meanwhile, there was scanning of open spaces. Then once people were kind of on board, there was scanning of internal things, and meanwhile there were discussions that were going on with the people. And I think this is where, when the question of when we are looking at community's heritage, the knowledge of that heritage lies with the community, the understanding of that heritage lies with the community. It was so just the documentation in itself is not enough. That interaction of what that society is, how it comes together to understand what we are documenting becomes very, very important. So yeah, these are some pictures of Aditya and Sukrit talking to, usually the market is where the men sit, and I'll share with you a little anecdote that we had during our exhibition about the market. Once again, we had okay, I'll finish quickly. We had a questionnaire once again about different information that we wanted. Whose house is it? How many people live in the house? And I think it was on day one itself that we hit the roadblock that we are not going to get answers for many reasons. One is that the idea of a house is not the kind of, in villages, especially villages of Kutch, the idea of a house is not one house, and the idea of a property is not of my property versus your property. There's usually a large khadki, there are many houses in it, and as the family grows, there are going to be different places where the same family is going to extend the house. So you can see in the slide that Aditya had marked that this is one family. So how do you answer the questions of whose house is this? How do you answer the question of how many people in your family? What do you consider a family? Because the unit of the family is not same the way we understand the unit of the family. So those were the kind of challenges we faced. The idea of ownership, the idea of what is personal, what is commons, is very, very blurred as well. So we created a little conversation, guided conversation tips, where we said we are going to the two levels of these tips that we identified. One is to identify household level disruptions and changes in practice, and village level consciousness of what happened after earthquake. And kind of at a household level, we started asking about what is the spatial arrangement, how big is your house, where all it is, what are the kind of little changes that have gone on with time, what is the material and technology, and etc. etc. So these were the kind of conversations that we had. And based on all these conversations, Aditya's team came up with some of these conclusions where we found out that when India was Hindustan, the larger India, including Pakistan, this was on the trade route, and the large market that we see empty in Bela is empty because that trade route is closed now. So they mapped these different level of these things. This was also helpful in mapping communities that otherwise don't come in the public spaces that we were mapping. What were those communities? What were those houses? What was the public places in those areas? So those were the things that were mapped over here, and you'll see that we found Meghwal, Kumbar, and their own public places and their houses. Earlier on, we were only interacting with the darbars. And so we kind of found all these complex family relationships, what we call organic growth, and how material and the idea of tradition is extremely fluid compared to what it is there in our mind. The idea of tradition and modernity, that concrete is a modern material or steel is a modern material, whereas stone is a traditional material, are things in our heads. It's not necessarily are in the heads of people who are building it, those houses. And of course, a lot more aspirations and how they managed, how they understood earthquake resistance, etc., etc. And then very quickly, Bernadette has already talked about scanning, but Mridula made this fantastic process of how she's going to scan, and she kind of took a whole to part method. Bernadette talked about that it's important to connect things, so she first scanned the connections, and then she went to individual houses. These were the different houses that were scanned that you can see over there. And this is a list of stuff that she identified, that what are the do's and don'ts about 3D scanner, and never leave the 3D scanner unattended, and never make sure you shut it down if the temperature of it is more than 55 degrees, which when we were scanning was quite a bit of time. And there are cows. Those are the things, and managing curiosity of adults and children, data management due to pure internet connectivity, accessibility to critical systems. So there are many, many things. Advantages are basically, I think what she's listed over here is that this particular documentation method documents without bias, and it just documents things the way it is. And I think that's a very important advantage, and many advantages that Bernadette spoke about. And just the last part where I'm going to talk about the consent. That while we had talked about consent, and this was the consent form that we had expected people to sign, we had translated our brochure in Gujarati. It was explained to everybody whom we were scanning in Gujarati, and we had many people had also signed this consent document that agreed that we are going to put all this material out there and all of that. What we realized was that most of the people possibly didn't understand what we were doing or what they were consenting to. They said yes, but we were not sure whether they were knowing what they were saying yes to. And that is where the idea of exhibition over there was born, that if we really want to say that we have taken consent of everybody, we first need to show what we have, and after having shown what we have, and then we need to take a consent that, are you okay that we put this in a public domain? I think there are still a few houses where we are not sure if we've got consent or not, because once again, we're not sure whether we've been able to explain well enough or not. So that was the idea of the exhibition that we did. I'm sure all of you followed our stories. So there were these, we set this up in Bela. There are two critical points that I want to identify. The exhibition in itself, like we do over here, that we put up things and we expect interested people to come and see it. Now the thing is, most of you who come here are interested because you're students of conservation and you're going to, or history or architecture, and you want to see what's going on. So you will engage, you will ask questions. But in the places where we have documented, we have to introduce different tools of engagement. So puzzle, that CS had a brilliant idea that let's make a puzzle. And that's how people get interested in what you're doing. We also realized that the drone map was a more engaging tool. We kind of introduced an exercise called Mark Your House, Find Your House. Of course, this was too technical a drawing for them to find their house in, but the drone map was very interesting. They were able to find their house. And it was those ways that a lot of interest was generated about what this was, why we were doing, and then they started asking questions about why are we doing what we're doing, what does it mean to, why is it important to put in public domain, etc., etc. The other thing that was important is that while we assumed that doing one exhibition is enough, because of the caste dynamics, because of, I'm sure Aditya and Tanvi has explained a lot of it to you, because of the gender dynamics, we have to make sure we do our exhibition in multiple places so that we create accessibilities for people who otherwise don't have access to the first space. So for example, we did our first exhibition in the marketplace. And in the marketplace, there were mostly men, as you can see in the image. And after explaining what we were doing and kind of, it was the inaugural talk, I openly asked that, is it okay if the women also come here and see what we put up? And the answer was no, because women don't go to market. And we realized that quickly we have to find an alternative way of engaging women. So quickly we asked that what is another space, if you can provide us with other space where we can put up the exhibition the next day morning. And that's when where the women will come. And then I think the next day morning, the exhibition was put up in a temple. But then the realization was that not all communities will have access in temple. So I think Aditya, Tanvi, Mrudula, Zias, Bernadette, they all kind of went literally door to door to the group of people who were not either coming to the temple or to the marketplaces to explain what we were doing and get consent. And that's why I say that we are still not sure we've got consent from everyone. We are not sure. Everybody said yes, but we are not sure. And we are only going to put up things that are things on website where we are sure that we've got consent. So I think, yeah, and this is the last thing that we're doing. And Zias is our expecto patronum guy. He always finds a way of making things interesting. So yeah, this is today morning's exhibition. That's our next level of outreach. And I think Bernadette in her presentation explained what are we going to do next. And those including with outreach with policy documents, creating policy documents. And Rohit will be talking about guidances and things like that. So I think, yeah, that's where I'll end. Sorry for overshooting. I usually don't. I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Jigna. Rohit, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Let's hope the technology is by our side now. So I'm gonna
Yes, we
share
can see your screen now.
Perfect. Okay. I'm just trying to open it. Yes. All right. Okay. So I think the advantage of being the last is that it's all covered and you can summarize it nicely. So that's what I'm gonna do. Because my what I decided to speak on is role of documentation for post-disaster recovery of heritage, and I'm going to speak from the larger perspective of recovery of heritage, and then I will kind of go back to some of those slides that you have already seen in from Bela's documentation and see how that connects to the larger recovery process. So what happens when a disaster takes place? And a lot of heritage gets damaged, and you can see the kind of destruction that may happen may then pose a challenge on how to rescue heritage fragments from damaged houses. This is after Nepal earthquake, and how would you do that? The first step, of course, would be to do the documentation of what is standing, what is demolished, and then maybe you can, on the basis of that proper documentation, you'll be able to salvage some of those important heritage elements. For example, these windows, and then, of course, in a disaster situation, you will have destruction where things might be broken into different pieces. And you need to kind of really, like a jigsaw puzzle, like a Lego, you have to put it all together, organize it in a certain way, give the numbering, documentation, and then eventually be able to put them all back together and then reinstall them in any post disaster recovery project. So, of course, this whole process of recovery is really dependent on how we do emergency salvage. And if something happens, how are we going to do rapid damage assessment? What would be our emergency stabilization? How are we going to do temporarily store some of those elements that have been retrieved from those buildings? And then on that basis, we are going to do detailed interventions for recovery. So if you see that there's a whole process that one has to really look at if one has to understand what role does the documentation play. While we speak about physical aspect, it is as important as physical dimension to look at the intangible dimension, because we all know that in a heritage recovery process, you don't want to only bring back the structure or the materials or the visual appearances, but you also need to see how you can bring back the usage of the place, the spiritual associations of the place. I mean, this is again immediately after Nepal earthquake, when everything was in rubble, and this is one of the World Heritage sites. What people did for the first thing was to start praying, and make some kind of temporary stuff out there to start the process. And also at that in that earthquake, one of the things that they wanted to really kickstart was one of the processional routes, which had this procession had stopped while the earthquake was actually happened, and so they wanted to really kickstart that process, which means that this is the chariot which they build every year, and then they take it through the streets. So again, continuation of these social and religious practices is as important for the recovery process. So what does it tell us in terms of post-disaster recovery of heritage? We need to think about holistic recovery, which considers both the tangible and the intangible dimensions belonging to various sections of the community. We need to have a sustainable dimension added to recovery, which means that the recovery process is socially, economically, and institutionally sustainable and does not create dependencies on external actors in the long run. And then, of course, it has to be resilient, because you don't want heritage to recreate the kind of vulnerabilities that were there before the disaster. So you want to build back better, and you want to really use this as an opportunity to make those changes that are going to keep the heritage but also reduce those vulnerabilities. Now, in this whole kind of understanding of recovery of heritage, we have to look at documentation at different levels, because without having a proper documentation at various scales, whether they are from drawings, whether they are photographic, whether they are visual, and whether they are coming from historic records. And most importantly, as you have seen in this project as well, documentation is as much about getting opinions of the people, talking to people, having focus group discussion. This is all part of documentation, and we have to put it all together to really make a sense of documentation for the recovery project. So then coming back to again our project here, where again, as I said, we need to look at it at different scales and different levels. Some of the information will have to come at the larger settlement level, while the other at the cluster or at the building level. And that's what we actually followed in this project. You have seen these drawings, but just to kind of tell you that again, physical documentation has to coupled with the social documentation, the social structure of the place at the wider level, and then of course utilizing 3D laser scanning and kind of putting all these kind of data together from different sources is kind of the key that you have been seeing in this project as well. So again, going back to the cluster level and then moving to the building level, you need to kind of look at multiple scales and kind of understand the situation from that perspective. Now, let me now come back to the key question: how does documentation help in the recovery process in case of heritage? So, when we do any recovery for a heritage site, it has to be seen as something where we do something for heritage, but it has to be connected to what kind of inventory or documentation systems exist before a disaster takes place. So, what were the historical records? What are the pre existing inventories? What is the kind of a significance assessment done before is really the key for us, because that is the record that exists before a disaster. And then of course you also work with the larger disaster management system, right? If there is an earthquake, it is going to happen, and the recovery process for that will be kind of organized at a larger scale. So we have to think of which are those international, national, local agencies or NGOs involved, and then take it to the level of overall damage assessment, because that kind of damage assessment will be done for the larger, not for only heritage, but at a larger scale. But then our recovery plan, which is for heritage, has to actually make this connection of looking at the damage assessment procedures for heritage site, making interventions which are for the specific damage sites, and then also record the decision making process. So documentation actually will also involve documenting the process itself of recovery. And that essentially means that in terms of documentation, we need to look at three different aspects. Utilizing traditional building systems, social structure, and use patterns. Because without having a knowledge of how the situation was before the disaster, in terms of how people used to build, what was their social structure, how they used to use spaces internally and externally, public or semi-public or private spaces. And at the second point, you need to know what were the transformation processes that were happening before the disaster, so that it will help you to decide the needs and also analyze vulnerabilities. So, how people have been extending their houses, what have been their needs, and how have they incorporated their needs culturally. I mean, this is all part of understanding kind of vernacular heritage as an evolving heritage. No, so we need to kind of have a system of documenting that. And then, of course, we need to assess damage and risks to be able to develop recovery interventions. So I want to go back to another disaster that occurred in India, in Maharashtra in 1995. I just want to show you how documentation done even with the simple tools, I mean, we can go to the high level of documentation using all the gizmos that we may have, and we can do very simple documentation. But the key to us is that this kind of documentation can tell us a lot about how traditional building knowledge systems used to exist, whether we can reuse them or adapt them to the contemporary recovery needs is something that has to be the next step. But the first thing for us is to really be able to document all that exists in terms of the traditional patterns, even going down to the level of joinery details, because some of them might be very critical for us to understand how they have coped with these kind of disasters like earthquakes, where they have been living for years. So for generations. So basically, this all information can be then kind of taken down to the level of, in our cases, mapping of how the spaces are used internally and externally. What are the different access points used? How is it dealing with the topography of the whole site? And then also be able to combine that with different kinds of documentations, from recording how people are actually using the spaces to making their drawings using 3D laser. So it is this combination of different uses of spaces which becomes important. But at the same time, it's also important in terms of documentation to know how the processes of building happen. Because sometimes we forget in this whole urge to document the physical part, we forget that you need to actually look at different types of craftsmen who do different kind of jobs, and there we need to document their living craft practices as well. And so this has been translated into this project on Bela by looking at again how traditional systems have been existing in that area, and the documentation that you see actually detail out how workspaces are used, open spaces, private spaces, heights. You can actually, in fact, really understand how the different spaces are put to different uses. And that gives a lot of knowledge for us to really plan recovery better, which is more culturally sensitive. And that is the first thing that I mentioned, traditional building knowledge or traditional knowledge in the way you use spaces. And of course, the details also become really critical for understanding and documenting. The second part of the documentation that I was mentioning was about transformation processes that will help us analyze physical, social, economic, and institutional and attitudinal vulnerabilities, and also, of course, to know the needs of the people. And again, I want to come back to the case of Marathwada, where there was this earthquake, but without documenting how people have been adding over time, what changes have happened in the way people have been constructing. You know, here you can see the facade looks very nice, but behind is very poor masonry. You will understand what changes people have done in terms of adding mud on the roof or making kind of divisions internally, which create those vulnerabilities because of which your recovery, first of all, the damage happens. And you need to, of course, address that in your recovery process. So again, recovery documentation of how changes happen. I mean, this is just one of the documentation we had done that time, which shows this is what was provided immediately after the earthquake. But then this is how people change in 10 years, 10, 15 years after the earthquake. So you can really learn how people adapt. And this is documentation is a wonderful way of understanding this kind of change that happens. So again, to show you how transformations in the reconstructed and relocated villages in this case really tell you a lot about what are the vulnerabilities that are being created. This is just another example. This was what was provided, and this is what it turned out after a few years. So again, when we record for planning recovery, we also need to record how people have actually made changes over the years using different materials. Even it also shows how they make innovations in the way they adapt the spaces which are given to them to suit their living cultural patterns. So that's one another important thing that we should use documentation for. And of course, again, you can, I'm just showing you this work which was done a couple of years ago. Again, this can be done at multiple levels, right? I mean, and it can tell you a lot about how transformations at the larger settlement level, at the cluster level, or at the local level can really be very helpful for you to really understand what changes are being done or what are the needs of the people, and accordingly plan your recovery interventions. So this is just quickly to show you some of those images. Now, coming back to Bela, again, the same process we are doing, but now we have the advantage of using 3D laser technology, combining it with other forms of documentation techniques, and really trying and again making the same kind of analysis, but probably doing it with these new kind of empowering techniques that are available to us to really make good decisions in terms of how people are doing additions and alterations, and how we need to kind of incorporate them or learn from them in the way we design our recovery processes. So this is where additions and alterations of spaces are not only internally, but also the open spaces become very important. And then the last important part of documentation is for recording damages and for analyzing risks for developing recovery interventions. Because again, we need to record how the damage happened, because that is so critical. In this is from another example. In 2010, there was earthquake in Bhutan, and many of these structures were pulled down. But what we realized was that a lot of those structures were standing because they actually had a very good technology of wooden construction with masonry kind of a curtain wall. So they behaved very well. And we needed to kind of make sure that engineers understand that the damage patterns sometimes are not structural but non-structural, and the behavior of the traditional buildings is very different than the behavior of new buildings. So this kind of a understanding of criteria and principles for damage assessment is really, really important for us, because we cannot apply the ones developed for engineered structures to the ones which are historic and vernacular, simply because the whole systems are very different. So damage and risk assessment needs to be seen as a process, and that means that we need to be first of all we need to know what needs to be done before for effective assessment. For example, documentation, inventories, or damage assessment forms, consulting team and coordinating the survey with stakeholders, preliminary assessment, temporary measures, clearing of debris, and then you make a detailed damage assessment, which will contribute towards the recovery process. Now, in this whole scheme of things, documentation plays such a key role, both in the emergency phase, in the debris recording, in the clearing of it, in preparing space for actually doing the entire recovery itself. For the detailed interventions. So just to, I'm not going to get into this, but what we need to do in the documentation process is also connect them to damage assessment forms. This was the one which was used in Haiti in 2010, and we developed it in order to connect the documentation to certain record, no, in terms of the material, the flow types. I mean, a lot of information comes together, and then you need to connect that to also documentation that exists before the disaster, because it will give you a lot of information. Sometimes those damages were there before the disaster, not really happening because of the earthquake, or have been just increasing afterwards. So we need to know the information beforehand. And so when we talk about documentation, I think it's important, and this is something that was done following Kerala floods, that we need to look at built heritage documentation in terms of the damages. Then we need to look at the movable and also look at the intangible, because we need to kind of consider all of them together. Coming back to again Bela, the same kind of a understanding of where the damages have been are now better done using these techniques, and combining with other kind of information will really give us a lot of data that can help us understand, why damages happen, whether we need to retrofit them, whether we need to replace them or reconstruct them. We need to make those decisions, and those decisions can really come up with this kind of documentation. If the cracks are structural or not, of course you need to consult an engineer, but this will give you, I mean, here you can see, one of the cracks that have been recorded. It can give you a lot of information on, which can be very helpful for an engineer to make a decision. So again, assessing damages and risks is really, really an important part of the documentation. And all this information has to be given to those who are actually taking decisions during the recovery process, no? So that they are able to do documentation, not just for documentation, but documentation as a way of making decisions, because otherwise it will not make any sense. So decision making process has to be embedded in the way we do documentation, and the guidance document that we are doing as part of this project actually tells this way of how to go about it for making those decisions in case we need to do a post earthquake recovery. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rohit. We have 13 minutes to take up some questions. Hello. Thank you for starting questions off in that window. If there are any questions from the online participants, I'd request you to put it into the chat window. Meanwhile, if there is any questions from the audience here, yeah, if you could please come here and ask the questions so that the members online can hear as well.
Yeah, we have learned about the post recovery of, but I'm not sure if there are some methods which we can use for the preconditioning of buildings for the disaster prone areas. So that's what I want.
So a large question. Uh, would, would either of you like to quickly comment?
Yeah, but I didn't get it exactly.
I think the question was more related to that can use this technology for assessing conditions for disaster prone areas before the disaster happens.
Yeah, so well, obviously that's kind of the ideal world. So the idea would be that you could record heritage buildings in kind of a good condition. So then it can stand as a record for the future, and then you can compare it after an earthquake, for example, or after a disaster. You can compare it. If you scan it again, you can compare damage and understand what happened and if something needs to change and so on. So for example, I think that the idea that would be helpful here is the idea of the systematic recording. So for example, in one of the villages in Chile, I have been working on that village in Tarapacá for a number of years. And the earthquake was in 2005. We came back in 2006. Then we came back in 2007. Then we came back in 2013 for my PhD. So throughout the years, you can see all the changes in the different houses. Some houses are exactly the same, just as the earthquake left them. And all of that is very relevant to understand the dynamics of what is happening after an earthquake as well. But ideally, of course, using these technologies to record what is happening before is very important.
Anyone else wants? It's understandable if you don't have questions now. You're letting everything. I'll just check online. Whoever's checking on YouTube, just let me know if there are any questions online. There aren't. Okay. So I'll just share the question that Shunya put. This one. Comment. Yeah. So it out for the audio. To see beyond physical limitations of the human body to seek layers hidden in depths. Does preserving the data become more important if the heritage sites could be wiped out by groups like the ISIS? And then he's put in a second question, which is creative ways of engagement to open up the perception of the local community is like doors on both sides. Is it like give and take? It seems like they learned the process of documentation using unknown machines for the first time, which made them curious and engaging. He's talking about the children. So
I think I'll take Kamal has already responded to the first one, but next one is not a question, but I think it is a little premature to assume that people who are in the town and with the village and who engage with us know how to document with our technology. I think it's a little premature to assume that. What this engagement does is that it kind of creates curiosity about the built environment that you engage with on a day-to-day basis, and to an extent you may also take it for granted. Unless, like I think that example that this the son of Lakshman Bhai, who actually lives in Ahmedabad, wrote an email, and that look at Bela. He wrote that email after he was out of Bela. So usually when you are away from your own environment, there is a sense of nostalgia, you value it differently because you've also seen other built environments, and there's that sense of value is usually kind of related to something that is, or that you attribute those values to something that is not a part of your day-to-day engagement. So I think these kind of events create those little moments in life where you become curious about where you're living, and you are in a way indulging somebody else's curiosity about your built environment, but in that process also being curious yourself. So I think those are little moments in lives of the people who are there. So I wouldn't say that, yes, it is exciting. It was extremely exciting for us and it was extremely exciting for them. And I hope it was a give and take. And I just hope that we were not parasites sitting there. But I think assuming that they've learned how to document is a little premature, is what I would.
Thank you. Yeah, why don't you come here and share your question?
So I was, in terms of community engagement, while working in Dharmaj, we spoke, while we were working on individual structures, we still spoke to the people around a little to understand. I mean, in our language, we're trying to understand how people are viewing the buildings. But we have a certain way of approaching it, I feel. We have certain words in our head, like heritage and significance and values. And so we're sort of thinking in these frameworks, and we're trying to approach people who don't have the same frameworks. And we're approaching them in a like a third language. I'm speaking in Hindi, which is a third language to me, and they're speaking in Hindi, which is the third language to them. So there's already a lot of communication gap, and on top of that, these ideas itself are, it's difficult to communicate the ideas. Like, we're trying to filter out certain understandings, how they view the structure. So one of the tactics that was suggested to us is to ask, okay, what if the structure was demolished? How would you feel about that? And yes, that did get some response from them. Oh, no. Then it's important. But until that point, they were just, they didn't have any opinions about the structure. So when you're working in multiple areas, you're not necessarily working in your own region or that you're familiar with. So how do we find that language and that connection to sort of build that understanding?
I think that's where visual language matters. So you create a visual language, and what we do through exhibitions is to create that visual language. So whenever we were talking about, one is that, we had an advantage of being able to talk in Gujarati, which is the first language for me and which is the first language for people living there. That's an advantage. But even with that, Gujarati doesn't have translation of many of these words that you just said. So it's impossible to explain conservation in Gujarati without going on and on about it for 10 minutes. It's impossible to explain significance or even heritage the way when we say Varso or in Gujarati, it's more inheritance. It's not heritage is kind of this abstract idea that we all share as a value. It takes a long time to explain that. So we tend to not do that, and that's why we tend to use the visual language to do it. And I think that is where it helps to kind of put the spoken language secondary. Make that your secondary tool. Don't make that your primary tool. Is the thing that we have been doing with Bela as well. Mridula wants to add something to it.
I just wanted to say if you would like to share the experience of whole translation for website as well as the pamphlets actually, because it was quite challenging. And I think partially I can relate with Revti's question because for me, I was kind of outside the region and I faced that challenge. And then again we are kind of we were a team of 5 there, and all of us actually spoke different languages, and Tanvi and Jigna, they were our main communicators with the villagers. So just going there with the fancy equipment was not sufficient because everything then became more about the equipment rather than the purpose. So also this work that we presented today, it is the effort of 3 field trips, if I can say. So developing that relationship slowly and gradually, that was also important to break that language barrier in certain ways. And as Jigna mentioned, eventually it was more about creating visuals, showing them those visuals. So when we were even scanning, the scanner screen doesn't show the realistic picture. It shows that precursor to that. It shows the partially processed 2D picture. So they were not understanding that what exactly we are doing. So eventually we ended up saying that we are only recording. They thought that we are doing video recording. So that whole consistent dialogue was very important, keeping them constantly informed, either in the form of their, in their language or in the visual language. That helped us. It's a long process. It will still go on. So that's why people coming here for this exhibition, we going there, that kind of helped. Yeah, and that's it from my side.
Gamal, yeah, over to you.
All right, thank you. Do you hear me?
Thank you.
All right, thanks. I think that's a very important question, and I tried to allude to in my talk that working partnership is key here. And I think we sometimes that assume that we are coming from same city or same place, so we command same knowledge. But education, but heritage and heritage traditions are associated with this built environment with community, and that's why communities are the center, because it's a learning process. It's an educational system in place in connection to the built environment, to the people, and to local groups. And hence, working with partnerships here means advocacy and means agency. And here we look always when we work on different places, as I showed in my map, and of course, similarly, as Jigna mentioned about different languages, different communities within even Bela. So every time you dig deeper, you will find different groups. And different groups have a kind of a social system, a cultural system, a leadership system. And in that way that you cannot really come from SEPT or from NTU or from anywhere else and then come and assume that you will really be able to communicate with them or advise them or tell them what you do. You always need to have some kind of a mediation through local researchers, local people, and who they trust and who they understand communicate with you. And I think in a project like Bela, we have Horn Salaf Foundation, which was key to really command this kind of local knowledge, local understanding, and at least to have a common communication system that makes us here, as far as in the UK, understand what's going on in Bela, but also we, as Jigna mentioned at depth, is a kind of a local understanding of what is happening in Bela. And as a village as it is similar principles applies in different places. And we discuss this at length in the development of this project. We need always to have such kind of local knowledge and learn from it. So in a way, it's a two ways communications. They learn from us, but we learn from them. And we need to have always somebody who just, or a few people who really facilitate that communications and make sure that that we learn from them, and there is a kind of a mutual knowledge and mutual benefits. So they benefits, but we benefits, and that's why it's called working partnership. So heritage here is not really, we meant it in every word of that we mentioned about community at the center. They are the producer of that knowledge, and we are just there to help to document and understand it more than anything else. For them to give you accessibility to such kind of private places is the most difficult thing that you would imagine anywhere else in the world. So such kind of, and this command trust, understanding, and appreciation. And I think those things that don't appear very normally in the research paper or research team or research course, but actually they are at the heart of everything that you do if you like to work and preserve cultural heritage of any place around the globe. And I think this was key to this project, as it was key to many other places where we work. I hope this is helpful. Thank you.
I just want to say something, because we said it this morning when we started with the activities, which is along the same lines of what Gamal was saying. Is basically this is a collaborative effort with the partners that it would have been impossible otherwise. So you could have all the technology you want, and you can have the latest
sustainable forms of action to prepare communities to be able to hold on to their environment and value their environment, and in a sense, in the broadest sense, contribute to ideas of heritage. So thank you all very much for bringing your time, effort, and for allowing those of us who are outside the project a view into the effort and the energy and the sort of intellectual labor it takes to put something like this together. So thank you all very much, and I hope there will be more opportunities for projects such as these. Thank you all and wish you a very good evening.
Can I thank Gloria? I wish to thank you for moderating the session, and I wish to thank, we are here away, unfortunately we couldn't be with Jigna and Bernadette and Murdalla there, but we wish to thank you very much at SAPT University and the Center for Heritage Conservation for organizing the exhibitions, and we would have loved to be there, but our apologies for the travel, and it was an exceptional experience, and thank you very much everyone for hosting us today.
I'll just kind of repeat the thanks. Thank you very much, Gamal. Thank you very much, Rohit, for being, I think, presenting the broader, both of you presenting a broader perspective to what we have been doing. And of course, Bernadette, Gauri. But I think most of all, thank Aditya, Tanvi, Mrudula, Zias, Drishti, who kind of pitched in the last minute, Satvika, who's getting married today, and yeah, I think the amazing team at CRDF who've been really, really helpful in putting all of this together at such a short notice, and also I think in kind of flawless way. I was just looking at the background that where we are sitting, and it looks like we are in some sort of a paradise and having this discussion. So thank you very much for putting all of this together, and thank you all the students who are here, people who are online, and engaging with us and sharpening our ideas. We'll have to answer the questions more robustly that you've asked. So thank you very much. We bring it to the close now. Yeah? Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day.